The pickup truck rattled along the dirt track, spitting gravel and dust. Ethan braced himself against the doorframe, trying to look like he belonged. He didn't. Not here, not anywhere. Maple Creek Farm wasn't a destination. It was a refuge, bought and paid for with a new name and a carefully constructed ghost of a past. The truck lurched to a stop, and a man emerged from the farmhouse, silhouetted against the golden light of the late afternoon sun. Silas Blackwood. He was everything Ethan had pictured from their phone calls, weathered, tall, and possessed of a gaze that seemed to scan beneath skin. "You must be Ethan," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't offer a hand, just assessed. "Welcome to Maple Creek." "Thanks for having me," Ethan replied, forcing a neutrality he didn't feel. He'd practiced the tone, the cadence, the carefully blank expression. It was a shield. Silas barely acknowledged the response. "Clara's inside. She's been prepping supper. You'll be staying in the west room, above the stables." He gestured with a calloused hand towards a sprawling two-story structure attached to the main house. Before Ethan could respond, a figure detached itself from the farmhouse doorway. Sooty, a woman. Her hair the color of burnished copper, falling in waves down her back. Clara Blackwood. She moved with a fluid grace that contradicted the rough-hewn surroundings. Her smile was genuine, unforced, and it hit Ethan with an unexpected force. He'd known she existed, of course, seen photos, but the images hadn't conveyed the effect she had in person. A warmth bloomed in his chest, unwelcome, dangerous. "Ethan, it is good to finally meet you." Her voice was softer than her father's, melodic. "We're glad you're here." He managed a nod. "Good to meet you too." Silas didn't linger on pleasantries. "Let's get you settled. You start with the sugaring tomorrow. It is hard work, but it'll keep you busy." Busy was exactly what Ethan needed. The west room was Spartan but clean, smelling faintly of hay and wood smoke. A single window overlooked the sugar bush, the forest a dark, brooding mass against the fading light. He dropped his duffel bag on the bed, the weight of it a physical reminder of everything he was trying to leave behind. The smell of wood smoke was everywhere, thickening with the sweet, heady aroma of boiling sap as he followed Silas and Clara into the sugar house after supper. The building was a cavernous space, dominated by a massive evaporator. Steam billowed, clinging to the rafters, casting shadows that danced with the flickering flames. "This is where the magic happens," Clara said, gesturing towards the evaporator. "Takes about 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup." Silas explained the process in curt, economical terms, outlining the work Ethan would be doing: fording, collecting sap, monitoring the evaporator, finishing the syrup. It was physical, demanding, and perfectly suited to his purposes. "You'll learn quick enough," Silas said, his gaze unwavering. "I don't tolerate idle hands." Ethan said nothing, just nodded, and began absorbing the details. The rhythmic hiss of the evaporator, the metallic tang of boiling sap, the wood smoke that permeated everything. Fundi. It was a sensory assault, a constant present. It was a good distraction. The next few days fell into a routine. Up before dawn, trudging through the snow-dusted woods, tapping the maple trees and collecting the clear, icy sap. It was a lonely job, a deliberate attempt to isolate himself. He deliberately avoided engaging in prolonged conversations, answering questions with short, measured responses. But Clara had a way of breaking through his defenses, of drawing him out with a simple question or a shared smile. She'd bring him coffee in the sugar house, ask about his day, and tell him stories about the farm, about her parents, about her life. One afternoon, while inventorying the finished syrup in the small farm office, Ethan noticed something wasn't right. Silas kept meticulously handwritten ledgers, detailing every sale, every expense. But the numbers didn't add up. Several large cash withdrawals were listed with vague descriptions: supplies, equipment, miscellaneous, but the corresponding entries in the inventory records were missing. Barrels of syrup were unaccounted for, or marked as sold at significantly lower prices than normal. He double-checked, then triple-checked, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wasn't an accountant, but he understood basic bookkeeping. This wasn't a simple error. This was deliberately obscured. A flicker of unease settled in his stomach. He'd chosen this place specifically because it was remote, quiet, and unremarkable. A place where no one would ask questions. But Silas Blackwood, for all his gruff exterior, wasn't an unsophisticated man. And these irregularities, they suggested something was going on beneath the surface. Something that could potentially expose him. A wave of dizziness washed over him, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. Images flashed through his mind. Cinta, a sterile interrogation room, a harsh fluorescent light, the relentless questioning. He blinked, trying to push the images away. It had been 5 years. 5 years since he'd been Daniel Archer, a detective with the Philadelphia Police Department. 5 years since the Cordova case. The Cordova case. Even the name felt like a phantom weight on his chest. He'd been so close to bringing down Victor Martel, the head of a ruthless drug cartel. He'd built a solid case, gathered irrefutable evidence. But Martel had connections, powerful ones. And somewhere had leaked information to the cartel. The raid was compromised. His informant was killed, and he'd barely escaped with his life. Internal Affairs had investigated, of course. He'd been cleared of any wrongdoing, but the shadow of suspicion lingered. The department had been fractured, trust eroded, and he, Daniel Archer, the Golden Boy detective, had simply vanished. He gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white. He'd traded a life of purpose for a life of anonymity, a life of risk for a life of quiet desperation. He hadn't run from the law. He'd run from the ghosts. He looked up as Clara entered the office, carrying a steaming mug. "Rough day?" she asked, her voice gentle. He forced a smile. "Just getting used to the numbers." She placed the mug on the desk, her hand brushing against his. A jolt of electricity shot through him. He looked into her eyes and saw a warmth, an openness that both intrigued and terrified him. "My dad can be intense," she said, her smile fading slightly. "He cares about this farm more than anything. It has been in our family for generations." "I can see that," Ethan said, taking a sip of the coffee. It was strong, black, and tasted of cinnamon. "He doesn't easily trust people," Clara continued, her gaze meeting his. "But he seems to accept you." Acceptance was a dangerous thing. It meant letting his guard down, allowing himself to feel something. It meant risking everything he'd worked so hard to protect. "I try to keep to myself," Ethan said, his voice carefully neutral. Clara's expression shifted, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. "I know you do." She lingered for a moment longer, her presence filling the small room. He wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the gap between them, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the weight of his past. Finally she turned and left, leaving him alone with his thoughts, and the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. He returned to the ledgers, determined to get to the bottom of the discrepancies. He found Silas's personal ledger tucked behind a stack of invoices, bound in worn leather. The handwriting was the same, but the entries were different. These weren't farm expenses. These were transactions, large sums of money flowing in and out, with no apparent source or destination. He flipped through the pages, his heart pounding in his chest. One entry, dated just last week, caught his eye. A withdrawal of $50,000, listed simply as payment Thuffentuin, J.D. He'd never heard of anyone with those initials connected to the farm. But something about the entry felt familiar. His gut twisted. Then, on the following page, a single, handwritten annotation in the margin, scrawled in a hurried script. The arrangement is compromised. The chill of the morning seeped into Ethan's bones as he walked the sugar bush, tapping new holes in the maples. The rhythmic thud of the hammer against the spouts was meditative, a temporary balm for the churning in his gut. But the peace didn't last. His mind kept returning to the ledgers, the inconsistencies, the cryptic entries. Back in the farmhouse office, while Silas was overseeing the first run of sap, Ethan delved deeper. He cross-referenced the handwritten records with the farm's bank statements, meticulously provided by Silas during the initial paperwork. The gaps were wider than he'd initially thought. Significant quantities of syrup were listed as donated to local charities, but he could find no record of any such donations. Cash deposits didn't match reported sales. It was a labyrinth of obscured transactions, designed to hide something. He spent hours poring over the documents, the sweet scent of maple doing little to soothe his growing anxiety. He began to compile a list of discrepancies, a running tally of unaccounted funds. The numbers climbed steadily, painting a picture of a farm teetering on the brink of financial ruin, yet somehow managing to funnel substantial amounts of money off the books. He needed to be careful. He couldn't afford to arouse Silas's suspicion. He had to approach the subject obliquely, probe for information, without revealing his intent. During lunch, he steered the conversation towards the farm's finances. "Business seems steady," he offered casually, taking a bite of Clara's homemade bread. Silas grunted. "Steady enough. How long has the family been running the farm?" Silas's gaze narrowed. "A long time. My grandfather started it back in the 20s. Been in the family ever since. Must be a lot of history here." "It is," Silas replied, his tone clipped. "And a lot of hard work. I imagine it has gotten harder over the years," Ethan pressed gently. "Farming isn't what it used to be." Silas's jaw tightened. "We manage." "I was just wondering," Ethan continued, "with the cost of everything going up, how you handle the off-season. It has to be tough relying on a seasonal income." Silas slammed his fork down. "That is none of your concern, Ethan. You're here to work the sugar bush, not to ask about my finances." The reprimand was sharp, unexpected. Ethan felt a cold wave of apprehension wash over him. He'd hit a nerve. "Sorry," he mumbled, forcing a placating smile. "Just making conversation." Silas didn't respond, turning his attention to his plate. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Clara, sensing the shift in atmosphere, subtly changed the subject, directing her questions towards Ethan, effectively deflecting Silas's ire. Later that afternoon, while Clara was preparing dinner, Ethan sought her out. "I was talking to my uncle back in the city," he lied smoothly. "He is an accountant, and I mentioned the farm. He was asking about the business. I just wanted to get a better understanding of how things work here." Clara hesitated, her expression guarded. "Things have been difficult lately. The syrup market is volatile. Costs are up. We've had a few bad seasons." "Your father didn't seem to want to talk about it," Ethan observed. Clara sighed. "He is a proud man. He doesn't like to show weakness." "What exactly is the biggest challenge?" She looked around nervously before responding. "The land taxes. They've been increasing every year, and a few years back, my mother needed some expensive medical care. It put a strain on everything." Her voice trailed off, her eyes distant. Ethan sensed that she wasn't telling him the whole story. There was a weight in her voice, a sadness that spoke of deeper trouble, driven by a growing sense of urgency. Ethan returned to the office after dinner. He resumed his investigation, meticulously combing through the records. He discovered a hidden folder on Silas's computer, password protected. He bypassed the security with relative ease, a skill learned during his previous life. Inside, he found a scanned copy of a bank statement, issued by a bank in the Cayman Islands. The account was registered to Blackwood Holdings, a shell corporation he'd never heard of. The balance was substantial, summed over $2 million. A quick search revealed that Blackwood Holdings had no discernible business activity, no legitimate purpose. It was simply a repository for illicit funds. His suspicions were confirmed. Silas Blackwood wasn't just a struggling maple farmer. He was involved in something far more complicated and likely illegal. The next morning, he was about to continue his research when he ran into Jed, an older man who used to work for the Blackwoods, now tending a small roadside vegetable stand. Jed was known around town for his taciturn nature and a simmering resentment towards the Blackwood family. "Heard you're helping Silas with the sugaring," Jed said, his voice gravelly. He didn't offer a greeting. "That is right," Ethan replied cautiously. Jed studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowed. "He is a hard man, Silas, always has been. Demanding. Doesn't like anyone poking around in his business." "I haven't been poking around," Ethan said quickly. Jed chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Everyone pokes around eventually. Just be careful. Some things are better left alone." He paused, then leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Family business. That is all I'm saying." The warning hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the danger he was courting. He spent the rest of the day tapping trees, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The woods seemed darker, the shadows more menacing. He glanced over his shoulder frequently, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck. As dusk settled, he returned to his cabin, eager to continue his investigation. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, expecting the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke. Instead, he was met with chaos. The cabin had been ransacked. Drawers were pulled open, clothes scattered across the floor, papers strewn everywhere. His laptop was missing, the small safe he'd installed, containing a few personal belongings and a burner phone, lay open, emptied. Someone had been searching for something, and they'd found it wasn't there. A cold dread gripped him. He wasn't being paranoid. He was being hunted. And whatever secrets Silas Blackwood was guarding, someone else wanted them too. He raced to find his car keys, heart hammering against his ribs, knowing he wasn't safe anymore. As he opened the cabin door, he saw a single playing card lying on the porch, face up, the Queen of Spades. The Queen of Spades stared back at him, a stark black symbol against the pristine white snow. It felt like a declaration, a cold, calculated threat. Ethan scanned the surrounding woods, but he was alone. The wind was picking up, whipping snowflakes into a frenzy, blurring the edges of the clearing. He quickly secured the cabin as best he could, a futile gesture against whoever had breached it. Nothing outwardly valuable was missing, which meant they weren't after his possessions. They were after information. He needed to tell someone, and the only person he could even consider trusting was Clara. He practically ran back to the farmhouse, finding her in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread. The aroma of yeast and flour offered a momentary comfort, but it couldn't soothe the knot of fear tightening in his chest. "Clara, we need to talk," he said, his voice strained. She looked up, her expression questioning. "What is wrong?" He led her into the parlor, closing the door behind them. He didn't bother with introductions, skipping straight to the point. He laid out the ledgers, the bank statements, the data he'd unearthed, presenting a damning case against her father. Clara's face drained of color as she scanned the documents. Her initial disbelief gave way to shock, then to a growing sense of horror. I don't understand," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "My father would never. He has been hiding money, Clara, a lot of money, in an offshore account, and he is making payments to someone Foindai, or something Foinde, called the Collector." She snatched the bank statement, her fingers trembling. "Blackwood Holdings. I've never heard of this." "He has been keeping secrets from you," Ethan said, his tone gentle. "For a long time, I think." Tears welled up in her eyes. I "I don't know what to think." He always said the farm was struggling. He said we were barely making ends meet. He lied. Together, they revisited the ledgers, searching for clues. Substantial payments to the collector that coincided with periods of financial hardship for the farm. The payments were untraceable, routed through a series of dummy corporations and anonymous accounts. "It is like he is paying someone to keep something quiet," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Or to make problems go away," Ethan added grimly. What could he be involved in? He hesitated. He wasn't ready to reveal his past, but he knew she deserved some honesty. "I used to be a detective," he admitted, carefully omitting his name and the details of the Cordova case. "I've seen a lot of things, and this smells bad." Clara stared at him, her surprise evident. "A detective, all this time?" "It is a long story, but the point is, I know how these things work. Your father isn't just a maple farmer, Clara. He is mixed up with something dangerous." Her father's behavior began to shift subtly but noticeably. He was more withdrawn, more irritable. He started scrutinizing Ethan's every move, his gaze lingering a beat too long. He'd ask pointed questions about Ethan's day, trying to discern what he'd been up to. During dinner, Silas launched into a tirade about the importance of loyalty and the dangers of meddling in things you don't understand. "Some things are best left buried," he said, his voice low and menacing. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular, but Ethan felt like the words were directed at him. Clara tried to diffuse the tension, but her efforts were ineffective. The atmosphere at the table was suffocating. "It is getting late," Silas said abruptly, pushing back his chair. "Ethan, I want you to focus on the sugaring. That is all I'm paying you for." As if to punctuate his statement, the weather turned. The sky, already overcast, darkened. With an ominous intensity, fat snowflakes began to fall, swirling and dancing in the wind. Within hours, a full-blown blizzard was raging. The farm became isolated, cut off from the outside world. The snow piled up relentlessly, burying the landscape in a thick, white blanket. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the windows and shaking the walls of the farmhouse. "Looks like we're stuck here for a while," Clara said, gazing out the window. "It could be worse," Ethan replied, though he didn't believe it. The isolation felt less like a natural consequence of the weather and more like a deliberate imprisonment. That night, Ethan barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He kept replaying the image of the Queen of Spades in his mind, trying to decipher its meaning. He knew he was in danger, but he didn't know the source of the threat. He got up before dawn, needing fresh air, needing to reassure himself that he wasn't losing his mind. He pulled on his thickest coat and ventured outside, trudging through the waist-deep snow towards his cabin. As he approached the door, his heart leaped into his throat. Glued to the wood was a small, sealed envelope. He hesitated for a moment, then tore it open. Inside was a single, typewritten note: "Leave Maple Creek Farm now, before you dig up things you shouldn't." The paper felt cold in his hand, the words burning into his mind. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. And it was only a matter of time before someone made good on it. The note felt like a physical blow. Ethan crumpled it in his fist, his mind racing. He couldn't leave. Not now. Not when they were finally getting close to the truth. But he also knew he couldn't ignore the threat. "We need to find out who sent this," he told Clara, recounting the discovery. "It has to be Jenkins," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "He has been circling the farm like a vulture ever since my mother died. He always said my father was a fool for not selling out to him years ago." Harold Jenkins was a local businessman, with a reputation for ruthlessness and a portfolio of shady dealings. He owned the town's lumber mill, the hardware store, and a vast tract of land bordering the Blackwood farm. He was a man who got what he wanted, one way or another. They spent the morning piecing together information, sifting through old records, making discreet inquiries around town. The picture that emerged was damning. Silas Blackwood had a gambling problem, a secret he'd hidden from everyone, including his daughter. He started small, years ago. Old Man Hemlock, the town's unofficial historian, told Ethan during a carefully orchestrated conversation at the diner. Poker games, horse races, but it escalated. He racked up debts he couldn't pay. According to Hemlock, Silas had turned to Jenkins for help, taking out a series of loans with exorbitant interest rates. The loans had been secured against the farm, essentially giving Jenkins a claim on the property. "It has been a slow bleed," Hemlock said, shaking his head. "Jenkins doesn't want the farm. He wants what is under the farm." Clara confirmed Hemlock's suspicions. "Jenkins has been pressuring my father to sell him the mineral rights. He knows there is a vein of lithium running under the property. It is worth a fortune. Lithium, a key component in batteries, in high demand. The Blackwood farm wasn't just a piece of land. It was a potential gold mine." They confronted Silas in the farmhouse kitchen, laying out the evidence. He initially denied everything, vehemently protesting his innocence. But confronted with the irrefutable facts, his resistance crumbled. "It started innocently enough," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "A few bets here and there, a way to unwind, but it got out of control. I lost more than I could afford. Jenkins offered me a way out. A loan. I thought I could pay it back." He paused, his face etched with shame. "I was wrong. The debt just kept growing. Jenkins kept adding to it, exploiting my weakness." "And the mineral rights?" Clara asked, her voice cold. "Jenkins knew about the lithium. He offered to wipe the slate clean if I sold him the rights to the land. I refused. I couldn't bear to lose the farm, the legacy of my family." "So he has been bleeding you dry ever since," Ethan said, his jaw tight. "He threatened to foreclose, to take everything I've worked for." As if on cue, a truck rumbled up the driveway, kicking up a spray of snow. Harold Jenkins emerged, a hulking figure clad in a black leather jacket. He strode into the kitchen, his eyes scanning the scene with a predatory gaze. Well, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Looks like you're having a family meeting, discussing your little financial troubles." "Get out of my house, Jenkins," Silas growled, his eyes blazing with anger. Jenkins chuckled. Now, Silas, let's not get emotional. I'm just here to collect. The payment is overdue." "I need more time," Silas pleaded. "The sugaring season is just starting. I'll have the money soon." "Time is up, Silas. You've had plenty of time. Unless you meet my demands, I'll be forced to initiate foreclosure proceedings." "You wouldn't dare," Clara retorted, stepping forward to stand beside her father. Jenkins turned his attention to her, his eyes lingering on her face. "Don't underestimate me, little lady. I always get what I want." Ethan stepped between them, his hands clenched into fists. "You're exploiting this family, Jenkins. You're preying on a man's weakness." Jenkins sneered. "This isn't charity, boy. This is business." And Silas made a deal he is now failing to uphold. "That deal was made under duress." Ethan shot back. "Doesn't matter. A deal is a deal." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Silas lunged at Jenkins, knocking him off balance. A scuffle broke out, chairs overturned, voices raised in anger. Ethan intervened, separating the two men before things escalated further. "Let's all calm down," he said, his voice firm and authoritative. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Jenkins said, adjusting his jacket. "Silas, you have until the end of the week. Meet my demands, or lose your farm." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "And tell your new friend here to stay out of my business." After Jenkins departed, the farmhouse fell silent. Silas slumped into a chair, his face ashen. Clara knelt beside him, her arms wrapped around him in a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Silas shook his head. "It is my fault. I brought this on us. I should have been stronger. I should have said no." A few hours later, Clara woke Ethan with a frantic shout. "He is unconscious. Dad's unconscious." They found Silas slumped over in his chair in the parlor. He wasn't breathing. Clara frantically called for an ambulance while Ethan checked for a pulse. It was weak but steady. "What happened?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. "I don't know. I just came down to get a glass of water and he was like this." Clara was panicking, tears streaming down her face. "Jenkins was here earlier. It has to be him." Ethan examined Silas, searching for signs of trauma. There was a small abrasion on his forehead, but it didn't seem serious enough to cause unconsciousness. He checked Silas's pulse again, and a strange detail struck him. Silas's face wasn't just pale, it was subtly bluish. "Something's not right," Ethan said, his voice grave. "I don't think Jenkins did this." He glanced around the room, his eyes scanning for clues, and then he saw it. A faint, lingering scent in the air, a scent he recognized from his past, a scent he'd hoped never to encounter again, a scent of bitter almonds. Cyanide. The scent of bitter almonds clung to the air, a phantom presence in the otherwise sterile atmosphere of the farmhouse. Ethan's gut twisted. Cyanide. It wasn't a clumsy assault. It was calculated, precise. And it pointed towards someone with access to specific and deadly knowledge. The paramedics arrived, stabilizing Silas and transporting him to the nearest hospital. Clara was a wreck, alternating between grief and frantic worry. While she was occupied, Ethan continued his investigation. He meticulously examined the parlor, searching for any clue that might have been overlooked. He found it hidden in plain sight. A small, almost invisible scratch on the underside of Silas's coffee cup. A residue clung to the porcelain, too minute to be visible to the naked eye, but detectable with a forensic light source he'd managed to salvage from his old life and keep hidden in his cabin. The residue tested positive for cyanide, but the really damning discovery was tucked inside Silas's wallet, a recent bank statement showing a large deposit made directly into Jenkins' account. The deposit was dated the day before the attack. Silas hadn't been the victim of a random act of violence. He'd been making a payment, a final, desperate attempt to appease Jenkins, and that meant someone within the family had access to Silas's wallet, knew his routines, and had the opportunity to make the deposit. His gaze drifted towards Clara, who was pacing nervously in the kitchen. He'd allowed his feelings to cloud his judgment, to blind him to the possibility that she wasn't the innocent victim she portrayed. He'd convinced himself that she was a kindred spirit, a woman trapped by circumstance, desperate for a change. But now, doubts gnawed at him. He confronted her in the parlor, his voice controlled but firm. "I need to know the truth, Clara, everything." She flinched, her eyes wide with apprehension. "What are you talking about?" He laid out his findings, the cyanide, the bank deposit. He watched her face, searching for a flicker of guilt, a sign of deception. "It is not what it looks like," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Isn't it? Because it looks like someone poisoned your father and then made it look like Jenkins was responsible." Her resistance crumbled. Tears streamed down her face as she confessed. I was working with Jenkins. Working with him. To do what? To sell the farm, she sobbed. To get out from under my father's thumb. He was suffocating me. This farm, it is a prison. He refused to modernize, to adapt. He was determined to cling to the past, even if it meant ruining us all. She explained how she'd secretly contacted Jenkins months ago, desperate for a solution. Jenkins had seen an opportunity, recognizing her vulnerability and exploiting her discontent. Together, they devised a plan to sell the farm, using Silas's gambling debt as leverage. I didn't want him to get hurt, she pleaded, her voice choked with sobs. I just wanted a future for myself. You set up your father to take the blame, Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. You knew about the debt, the threats from Jenkins. You were the one facilitating the payments. She didn't deny it. I thought I could control it. I thought I could negotiate a better deal. I didn't realize Jenkins was so ruthless. And the cyanide, she paled. I don't know anything about that. I swear. Ethan didn't believe her. There was a coldness in her eyes, a calculated detachment that chilled him to the bone. She was a skilled liar, capable of manipulating others to get what she wanted. He learned that Clara had been instrumental in setting up the shell corporations, using her knowledge of financial regulations to conceal the flow of money. She'd been the one laundering the funds, the one ensuring Jenkins received his cut. You used me, Ethan said, his voice filled with bitterness. You pretended to need my help, to trust me all along. I started to care for you, she said, her voice barely audible. I thought maybe we could build something together, a life away from here. Her words felt like a mockery. He'd been a fool to fall for her charm, to ignore the warning signs. He'd allowed his past, his loneliness, to cloud his judgment. You're a liar, Clara, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. A manipulative, self-serving liar. He turned to leave, needing to escape the suffocating presence of her betrayal. As he reached the door, she called out to him. Ethan, please, you don't understand. This isn't just about the farm. It is about freedom, about breaking free from the cycle of debt and despair. He paused, but his resolve didn't waver. He couldn't trust her. He couldn't believe anything she said. Some cycles are better left broken on your own, he replied, and walked out into the biting wind. He returned to his cabin, needing to process everything that had happened. He felt a profound sense of loss, not just for the trust he'd misplaced, but for the naive hope he'd allowed himself to entertain. He'd come to Maple Creek seeking anonymity, seeking peace. Instead, he'd stumbled into a web of deceit and betrayal. As he was gathering his things, preparing to leave, his burner phone rang. He hadn't used it in months, relying on the security of encrypted messaging apps. The sight of the flashing screen sent a jolt of fear through him. He answered it cautiously. Archer, he said, using his old alias. You've been compromised. A gruff voice said on the other end. It was Miller, his former contact within the Philadelphia Police Department. Someone knows who you are. They're asking questions. You need to disappear now. The line went dead. Ethan stared at the phone, his blood running cold. His cover had been blown, and he had a feeling Clara had something to do with it. Ethan didn't run, not this time. He'd spent years disappearing, shedding identities, living in the shadows. But the playbook had always included a contingency for when the shadows turned hostile. Now was that time. He spent the next 12 hours immersed in digital forensics, dismantling Jenkins's financial empire. Piece by piece, the shell corporations, the offshore accounts, the fraudulent transactions, fraud. He meticulously documented everything, compiling a dossier of irrefutable evidence. His old skills, dormant for so long, resurfaced with chilling precision. He wasn't Daniel Archer, the fugitive, anymore. He was a predator reclaiming his territory. He discovered that Clara hadn't just facilitated the scheme, she had actively orchestrated it, manipulating Jenkins as much as he had manipulated her. She'd leveraged his greed, playing on his desire for the lithium deposit to secure a better deal for herself. The future she'd envisioned wasn't about escaping her father. It was about building her own empire on the ruins of his. With the evidence secured, Ethan contacted the state police, providing them with a detailed report and enough documentation to warrant immediate action. He didn't reveal his true identity, using a burner phone and encrypting his communications. He simply identified himself as a concerned citizen with information regarding fraudulent activity. The raid on Jenkins's lumber mill was swift and decisive. Jenkins was taken into custody without incident, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. Clara was apprehended at the farmhouse. Her composure finally broken. The look in her eyes wasn't defiance, it was hollow, defeated. Ethan then turned his attention to Silas. He knew the old man wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was a victim of his own weaknesses, manipulated by more ruthless players. He used his connections, remnants from his past life cider, to negotiate a deal with the district attorney. Silas would cooperate fully with the investigation, providing testimony against Jenkins and Clara, and in exchange, his legal exposure would be minimized. He'd likely face some penalties, but he would avoid a lengthy prison sentence. The weight of the past few days settled upon him as he sat beside Silas in the hospital waiting room. The old man's color was returning, his condition stable. "I don't know how to thank you," Silas rasped, his voice weak. "You don't need to," Ethan replied. "Just focus on getting better." Clara. She never understood. She wanted everything fixed overnight. She didn't understand the sacrifices it took to build this farm, to keep it going. Ethan offered a small, non-committal nod. He couldn't bring himself to judge Silas, or even Clara. They were both products of their circumstances, driven by their own desires and fears. "I'm leaving," Ethan said, stating the obvious. "Maple Creek isn't a place for me." Silas nodded slowly. "I figured as much. You're not built for quiet. You need something more." He found Clara in a holding cell at the local sheriff's office, her face buried in her hands. He requested a brief meeting with her, wanting to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice muffled. "Why did you do this?" "Because it was the right thing to do," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You crossed a line, Clara. You hurt people." She looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and regret. "I just wanted a better life. So did a lot of people," Ethan said softly. "But not everyone is willing to sacrifice their integrity to get it." He turned to leave, unwilling to linger any longer. The next morning, Ethan packed his meager belongings, leaving the cabin exactly as he'd found it. He traded his name, his life, for a few fleeting moments of peace. But peace, he realized, wasn't something you could buy or hide from. It was something you had to earn. He drove away from Maple Creek Farm, leaving the snow-dusted landscape behind. The road stretched out before him, an unknown expanse of possibilities. He had no destination in mind, no plan for the future. He was still a man without a name, without a past, but he wasn't running anymore. He was simply moving. As he reached the main highway, he pulled over to check his burner phone. He'd received a single new message, a cryptic string of numbers and letters, likely a secure communication channel. He ignored it, tossing the phone into a roadside ditch. He needed to sever all ties to his former life, to create a clean break. But he knew it wasn't that simple. The shadows always followed. He stopped at a diner a few towns over, ordering a cup of coffee. While he waited, he noticed a man sitting at the counter, watching him with an unnerving intensity. The man was dressed in a nondescript suit, his face obscured by a baseball cap. Ethan met his gaze, holding it for a moment before looking away. He knew that look. It was the look of someone who was searching, someone who wasn't going to give up easily. As he paid for his coffee, he noticed a local detective lingering near the entrance, casually observing the diner's patrons. Ethan caught the detective's eye and offered a slight nod. The detective approached him. "Just passing through?" he asked, his voice polite but probing. "Something like that," Ethan replied evasively. "You remind me of someone," the detective said, studying Ethan's face. "A detective I worked with years ago. Name was Archer. Daniel Archer." Ethan allowed a slight, enigmatic smile to play on his lips. "A lot of people resemble other people. Detective, it is a common occurrence." He paused, adding, almost as an afterthought, "Sometimes the stories we tell ourselves about our past aren't entirely true. The detective's brow furrowed, his gaze unwavering. Is that so? Ethan turned and walked out of the diner, leaving the detective to ponder his cryptic words. He knew he hadn't escaped entirely. His past was a shadow that would continue to haunt him, a reckoning that would eventually arrive. But for now, he was free, and that was enough. He started the car and drove on, leaving the diner and the detective behind. Trading one set of shadows for another, heading towards an uncertain future.